So the first part is the international part, where the international speakers will have their explanation on their experiences and know-how. And then the second part, I will hand over to Ms. Suvorova, and then you will guide us through the Russian part, I guess. Yeah? So I would like to start with the first description of the landscape of the international trends and what we've seen over the past years. Can you go to the... yeah. One more. Thank you. So what we've seen is that internationally enhanced relations between taxpayers and tax authorities have been increasingly popular, and more countries are now considering how to move to a system where taxpayers and tax authorities are working closer together. The drivers of that system are basically the desire and the necessity to reduce tax audits and tax litigations, so both the number of it and the content of it and the period in which the litigation and the tax audits take place. If you look at the system, it's not a development that's in isolation, because it's part of a more global trend, we think, where you see that companies are behaving much more responsible and are also forced to behave much more responsible by trends in society, like tax activism, where companies are basically promoted or stimulated to be the good citizen, right? But also there is much more emphasis on internal control over the tax function within companies, right? So if we can go to the next slide. What we see is that there are various alternatives for enhanced relations and different grades of how you can apply it. We see also in different countries we have different systems, but the basic system really is where you can declare your tax on the basis of a return, and the company needs to make sure that the return is correct, otherwise there will be severe penalties. If that's the case, the company needs to make sure that they are really in control and they know really what's in their tax return, because otherwise the tax authorities cannot rely on that return. The second system is a disclosure regime, where companies can file their tax returns and at the same time have to disclose all their uncertain tax positions. That's easier for tax authorities, because then they can read the uncertain tax positions and they can focus immediately on the uncertain positions, and they can have a discussion on how to resolve those points. Another system is where tax authorities and clients or companies work closer together in a form of horizontal monitoring. And the fourth one is where the tax authorities have a risk rating of the companies, which allows them to make sure that they place the right level of resources and the right level of review on the returns filed by those companies. Yeah? So what basically happened in the past years for the companies and for the tax authorities, in general, in enhanced relations, it's basically the companies have worked a lot to improve their tax function, to make sure that they have a proper tax governance structure, that they have a good strategy, good policies, that the tax function is not an isolated function within the company, but an integral part of the finance function and closer to the business, making sure that the companies, the tax people within the companies know what is going on in the companies, and they know what type of tax planning there is, what type of risks there are, how to reflect it in the tax returns. And that's really something that most of the taxpayers have invested in heavily. They have really built or improved a tax control framework, as we call it, which is the internal control system to make sure that they are always in control over their tax position. If you look at the tax authority side, they have seen the same development, but then from the other angle. For tax authorities, the real development has been to transfer from, let's say, a more conflict model between taxpayer and tax authority to a more collaborative model. And in the collaborative model, it has been essential for the tax authorities to rely on the activities performed by the companies. And because the company is working with their internal control framework, and the tax authorities can really rely on that and make basically accept the tax position as done by the companies. So, what do we expect as future trends, or as actually ongoing trends? What we see across the world is that much more countries are considering how to move to an enhanced relationship between taxpayers and tax authorities, like here in Russia, for example. Several countries are developing pilots at the moment to investigate what is the best local way to deal with enhanced relationships. Some are moving more to a horizontal monitoring model. Others are moving more to a risk rating model. That's all still under investigation. We believe that what we will see over the next 5 to 10 years probably is the development of an international standard of internal control, and international standards for companies to comply with in order for tax authorities to rely upon. And if that happens, we believe that really litigation and tax audits can reduce significantly, and the responsibility for companies to be compliant with the tax laws and regulations can be fulfilled more easily. That was my introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Henk Joosten, who is one of the key people at the Dutch Ministry of Finance, engaging in the deployment of horizontal monitoring. And Henk will tell you a lot more about the experiences in the Netherlands with horizontal monitoring.
Thank you. I should. Thank you. First, this. In the 18th century, the Italian philosopher Algarotti wrote about St. Petersburg est la fenêtre par laquelle la Russie regarde en Europe. The same concept found in the words by Pushkin in his poem The Bronze Horseman. From here by nature, we are destined to cut a door to Europe wide. It's a great honor for me to be here and take part in the World Legal Forum at St. Petersburg. Although horizontal monitoring started in my country, St. Petersburg will give it a stage and, in the words of Pushkin, a window to Europe and even to the whole legal world. My presentation, I have to change it 3 times. At first I thought, well, I've got something like an hour, and I had a working title saying Horizontal Monitoring, a Ticket to a Tax Heaven. I gave it to my boss and he said, Henk, you shouldn't do it. A ticket to a tax haven, it could easily be misunderstood. I said, well, I'm sure they're all very intelligent people there in St. Petersburg, but I skipped it. It was a speech of an hour, and the organization asked me to go back to something like 15 minutes. I have slides with me for more than an hour, but I will skip a lot of it and go back to the essentials of horizontal monitoring. You saw on the first slide, I had a different title. It was called Cooperative Compliance. I will explain it to you later. Horizontal monitoring in the Netherlands started something like 2002, when we as a government noticed that our society changed very hard. Globalization and individualization made a different society, and government had to respond to it. The government, being far above the citizens, wasn't the proper concept anymore. We should stay beside our citizens. And although horizontal monitoring is a bit odd term, when you talk to your children, say, well, I have done some horizontal monitoring, they think something like, I lay down in the fields watching the birds coming over. That must be horizontal monitoring. It has always been seen as a bit of odd term, so it has been changed. Horizontal monitoring in the Netherlands started with a pilot with 20 big companies. And with these 20 big companies, we tried to conclude a compliance agreement. And a compliance agreement is not a legal agreement. It's something like a sort of a gentleman's agreement. It said we are willing to work with each other on basis of trust, transparency, and understanding. It's almost the same when you go marry. The only thing you say, yes, I will, and afterwards all the things will fall into place. And that's really important. It's not a legal document. It's about attitude. It's about behavior. There is no legal foundation for horizontal monitoring in the Netherlands. Horizontal monitoring takes place within the boundaries of law, regulations, and jurisprudence. But there's no law or regulation about it. When we started with these 20 big companies, after 2 years, something like 2007, we evaluated it and we found out that it worked. With these 20 big companies, we had concluded these agreements. So we introduced this method to other, the mid-sized companies, and we even started with the small-sized companies to go to horizontal monitoring. But with a small-sized company, we had something like 1.2 million small-sized companies. Concluding individual agreements you can't do that. So we thought, let's take their tax advisors, conclude an agreement with these tax advisors, and all the clients of these tax advisors could be part of an agreement from the tax advisor with the tax administration. It's a triangular situation. There are 3 parties involved with the small-sized companies. Horizontal monitoring took its flight in Holland. In 2011, the State Secretary of Finance of the Netherlands asked a committee to investigate horizontal monitoring. And in June 2012, it's difficult to see, don't look at the slides. In 2012, the committee brought out its report. And the report said horizontal monitoring is here to stay in Holland. It's a good concept for the very large businesses. It might be a good concept for the middle-sized businesses, and rethink Dutch government about doing it to the smaller size companies, because it's a different game you're playing there. The basic principles of horizontal monitoring, I quoted them earlier, are justified trust. Trust must be objectivated. Don't look in each other's eyes, having blue eyes and saying, well, I trust you. It should be objectivated by behavior before. Transparency means disclosure of your books. And transparency means real transparency. Say what you are doing. You don't have to disclose your tax strategy, but you need to show what you are doing in your business. Show that you're under control, in control. Have a business control framework that we can monitor. Have a tax control framework which we can monitor, and we will review it and give you back our opinion about your tax control framework. And when we find it's okay, we reschedule our tax audit scheme. We won't tax audit you anymore, only by reality checks. Once in every time we have a reality check saying we took something like 10 tax audit files, monitor them, and this is our conclusion. Go around a round table, talk about it, and the company has either adjust its policies or could go on the way they were working. This tax control framework is very important to show that you're in control. International tax control frameworks should meet up some standard. Multilateral companies working in different countries should engage the same treatment by tax authorities as in every country. When there's some sort of a standard, it would be easier for the world. Yesterday, Mr. Medvedev said about regulations of countries. We're into a stage of harmonization, and the next stage will be to unify regulations. I think with horizontal monitoring, we're going the same way. Let's try to harmonize concepts, and to unify them will be a very different next step. The lessons learned from working with horizontal monitoring, and could you please go to the lessons learned on the table? The lessons learned. Well, okay. Lessons learned. One of the things, its technique isn't that fast as I am. Lessons learned. I will start with them. One of the very important issue for horizontal monitoring is the tone at the top. What we saw that we were talking always with the board of directors of a firm, with our highest ranking Dutch tax officials. Why? When the tone at the top isn't right, the whole company won't act the way horizontal monitoring thinks it should be. And even afterwards, when working with horizontal monitoring, the board of directors and the highest ranking Dutch tax inspector are the escalation, is an escalation moment when it is going wrong. When there's a disagreement about taxes, you could talk on the highest level and solve it. Soft skills are very important for tax inspectors and the tax committees of companies. Soft skills mean have the right attitude and have the right behavior. Coming in and saying, I'm a tax inspector, I've got all legal tools in my pocket, and I will see what you have to pay, isn't working anymore. You should be able to listen and to understand the business of the company. We found out it's more difficult than we ever thought. Even our own tax inspectors made so many mistakes coming in and saying, I'm a tax inspector, I will audit you. But they say I have to come for horizontal monitoring, but I just dislike horizontal monitoring. Come on, don't do that. Doing the right thing means also, I heard an example from a company where we wanted to investigate whether they're ready for horizontal monitoring. And he came in and to tax VAT, value-added tax, he wanted to investigate whether they filed the right amount of money. And he stayed there for a week, and after a week he told the director of that company, I found €1 difference between what you filed and returned and what should be filed. Don't do it this way. Horizontal monitoring internationally, on this moment in Moscow there's a meeting from the OECD, and there a report has been shown to the world saying from horizontal monitoring as a term to enhanced relationships, and even the term enhanced relationship is a bit odd. Enhanced means too cozy. You shouldn't be cozy. Tax inspectors, tax departments and companies shouldn't be cozy. Be professionals, but don't be too cozy. So the term enhanced relationship was abandoned for cooperative compliance, and that's the new term. And I think something like 24 countries have some form of horizontal monitoring, and it will expand. It's for bigger companies, mid-sized companies, very important to live in reality. When you're open, when you disclose, when you are transparent, you will get back certainty for this moment. A company is killed when we do a tax audit, found something like 2009, tax hadn't been just, so we impose another tax for 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, and you haven't had that money in your company, so you're dead and it's over. Living in actuality is for firms on this moment very important. I want to stay with this.
Okay.
Give the word back to Martin.
Thank you very much, Henk. Are there any questions for Henk at this point? Okay, then I would like to give the word to David John. He is the leader of the Russian tax practice for PricewaterhouseCoopers. But in addition to that, he's still a UK national, so he knows a lot about the system that is applied in the UK. David.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Federal Tax Service for the invitation to speak here. And I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words about the UK experience of horizontal monitoring, or as we call it, real-time audit. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So there was a reorganisation of the tax authorities in the UK in the mid-2000s, which resulted in the largest taxpayers, so the biggest 800 businesses in the UK, being dealt with by a separate group within the tax authorities. But real-time audit, and that helped the development of real-time audit, although it had actually started in pilot studies with large companies, a bit like the Dutch experience, in the early 2000s. And essentially this was an attempt to move the relationship between taxpayer and tax authority away from a hostile, distrusting, confrontational relationship to more working together, because the tax authorities understood that most large businesses, what they actually want in their tax affairs is certainty. They try to get things right and they want certainty. And the tax authorities wanted to free up resources to focus on the big issues, so kind of issues within large companies where very large amounts of tax were at stake, or to deal with a completely different group of taxpayers where the main concern was around tax avoidance and even tax evasion. So this, for the tax authorities, was about reducing the time that was being spent essentially monitoring companies that were trying to do the right thing anyway. Just as in the Netherlands, in fact, there is no separate set of legislation governing this. It's a completely voluntary process. And in fact, although real-time audit had been working for 3 or 4 years, it was only in 2008 that the tax authorities received information powers, on a real-time basis, so the ability to force taxpayers to give them data on a real-time basis. But in essence, it's a voluntary system, and the system is actually based on assessing whether a taxpayer should be regarded as low risk or not. And there are benefits, very big benefits, for a taxpayer to obtain the status of low risk. Essentially, it means a light touch with your control from the tax authorities, and it means that you're not subject to audits. And in the best cases, your annual tax return is not even reviewed by the tax authorities because they know what's in there through the transparent and proactive discussions that have happened through the year. And it consciously creates a relationship between the taxpayer and the tax authority that is based on trust, not a hostile, kind of confrontational relationship. And it's built on the expectation that the taxpayer will be proactive in the provision of information to the tax authorities. And when we talk about trust, we're not just talking about trust in people although that's important in this system, we're talking about trust in controls and systems. So within this, there's a framework for the tax authorities to make sure that they are comfortable with the internal controls that a company operates, and then how the information in the accounting system is reported in tax returns. And they start this process actually with a review of the efficiency and effectiveness of controls and that process of moving information from accounts to tax reporting. And because that is not an easy area, particularly for tax inspectors and in fact tax advisors, because it actually is to do with accounting controls and business processes, not tax legislation. The UK tax authorities employed specialists to review that area to make sure that they were comfortable. And they also made the senior accounting officer, or the top finance person in an organisation, personally responsible for correct processes so that the information being reported on tax returns is as correct as is humanly possible. In addition to that, there are behaviour-based penalties which are proportionate because they are based on their tax geared. And in the UK, it is the duty of the taxpayer to self-assess and to do that with due care and attention. So the position in the UK, it is the taxpayer's obligation to make sure that they are taking the correct tax position on every item. It is not to claim a deduction for everything that you feel you want to claim for and then let the tax authorities find it if they can. That's not how the system is built. It's very much the obligation of the taxpayer to adopt correct positions and for the tax authorities to review that through the real-time process. One absolutely huge advantage for taxpayers within this process is the ability to get rulings on uncertain tax positions. So in the UK we have a system, there are certain statutory rulings where you can apply for clearance on certain transactions. They will be treated the way that you want them to be treated, and that's set in tax law. You make an application and you get an answer. With real time, there are a whole heap of other things that are uncertain. At the end of the day, all tax systems are imperfect, despite the attention that drafters pay to drafting tax legislation. Of course, there are always areas open to interpretation. And most taxpayers would like to get uncertain tax positions agreed with their inspector. This process enables this, and rulings given by your tax inspector are binding with two very important caveats. The first is that they are making the decision on the full facts. So if you get a ruling but the facts are different, the ruling isn't valid. I think that's very fair. And the tax authorities have to use their own internal specialists where the ruling touches something that is of specialist interest. So, for example, if you ask for a ruling on your transfer pricing, the tax authorities must go to their transfer pricing experts to get expert input into that particular item. And if you do that, the tax audit is usually essentially an informal process of meetings and reviews, and it's only undertaken after the risk assessment process, and it is not undertaken lightly. So if you're subject to a tax audit, you can expect that to happen much less often, but more in depth. And this, in a nutshell, is one of the big benefits of the system, because if you establish through the the working relationship, the level of trust, and the tax authorities understand your business, and they understand the controls, and they trust the people that are kind of operating the tax function within the company, then you will be assessed as low risk, and you will be on the left-hand side of this diagram. So essentially very little control, and any significant changes will only happen in a 2 to 3 year cycle. If you are not low risk, then there's an assessment every year of what the risks in your business actually are, and then the tax authorities are required to make sure they've done enough work to deal with that risk, and therefore the process of compliance is a lot heavier and more active on both sides if the company is not low risk. So the prize for the taxpayer of being low risk is very high, because your compliance process is certain and quick, and for the tax authorities you are spending less time on good taxpayers. As this is tax, unfortunately, we don't always agree on everything. And sometimes with large companies in the UK, the amounts at stake can be very large indeed. And there is a specific dispute resolution process that is undertaken. And I would say there is a big difference between dispute resolution in the UK, because litigation in the UK is very much the very last resort, whereas here it's a much more common practice. So kind of litigation is very, very much kind of if absolutely everything else fails, we go to court. It's a different system. But the resolution of disputes is a very difficult area, particularly for the tax authorities, and particularly with this being a very hot political issue at the moment. So politicians a lot who don't understand the complexity of tax sometimes are afraid tax authorities are giving deals to taxpayers which are too good or unjustified. So what we have in the UK is actually a guidelines for how disputes can be resolved. And whilst it is true that most disputes are still resolved by negotiation, litigation is increasing as a result of this process. And actually, where large amounts are at stake, sometimes actually it is the right thing to do to let the court decide what the correct conclusion is. And in conclusion, from my own personal experience, I worked with 3 or 4 clients who were in this process. My own view of it is when it works properly, it is an absolutely great process for the taxpayer and for the tax authorities. And it really is best practice. And it requires a different mindset from the old mindset on both parties. So the taxpayer needs to be prepared to be open, proactive, to disclose the areas of concern and to attempt to resolve them with the tax authorities up front. And that actually is a huge, huge advantage for taxpayers, because historically, if you were undertaking a particular transaction that was large and the tax consequences it was uncertain, you would go to a firm like PwC or Ernst & Young, and you would get a tax opinion, and you would wait for the tax authorities to challenge, and then you would use the information in the tax opinion to defend. Now, you discuss up front with the tax authorities exactly what their view is. You will find their view, and you will come to some sort of resolution before you undertake the transaction. So you actually know exactly what the tax consequences will be, and the whole process is much cheaper and much more efficient for the taxpayer. There is one really important thing in my personal observation from the tax authority's point of view, though. The tax inspector dealing with the company must be able to take decisions. And actually, if somebody feels very uncomfortable about deciding things, then this process doesn't work at all. So part of the learning for the tax authorities is to make sure that they have strong people who are good technically, who understand and can build relationships with their customers and can decide things quickly and correctly. And this leads for actually the big aim of the tax authorities, which was to take resources away from controlling everything regardless of materiality, and they can now apply their resources in areas where there is very large amounts of tax at stake, or indeed to tackle evasion, people who just don't pay any tax at all completely illegally. That was what I wanted to say. I think I've run out of time, so I'll finish there and pass the word on.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you. Now, the next topic is the system in the US, which is the compliance assurance process. And in the interest of time, I'm going to show you immediately this slide, which is the flow chart of the process. Oh, sorry. This slide, I was going to say. Here you can see the system started in the US already in 2005 as a pilot, and meanwhile 140 companies are dealing with it. Those are really major companies. And the interest for the companies and for the US Inland Revenue Service is that, like David explained for the UK and like Henk explained for the Netherlands, that the companies know the position they file and that the tax authorities can accept the tax return almost immediately when it is filed. And if you look at this process, you can see at the left-hand side of the screen that during the year, the company and the Inland Revenue Service really have an intense relation, and they have a lot of contact points where they discuss what's going on real time. So they really discuss the developments, they discuss the transactions, and they discuss how the companies are going to reflect those transactions in the tax return. Then the company prepared a draft tax return, and at that point the draft tax return will be discussed with the IRS team. And the company explains the positions they took, they defend the positions, and the IRS can think about it and can comment on it, and basically a dialogue at that point exists. Then once the tax return is filed, in the US, unlike in many other countries, the tax return is not accepted immediately, but it's reviewed once again by the IRS, but then by themselves. Hopefully to find out that the tax return is exactly as they expected because of the relation they have gone through during the year. But if not, and if they find items in the tax return that were not discussed or not disclosed, the IRS still has the opportunity to go back to the company and to discuss those items again. So the system as applied in the US leads to a lot of benefits for the companies and for the IRS because it's much clearer. They have a much better understanding of how the companies work and how the IRS works. It leads to a huge decrease in tax audits and almost no litigation anymore in this respect for the companies that entered into the pilot. But on the other hand, it's really time intensive. And the resources allocated both by the companies and by the IRS are quite significant at this point. Yeah, this is what I wanted to share on the CAP system as applied in the US. Are there any questions on the international trends and developments? Okay, then for the sake of time, I would like to hand over to Ms. Suvorova.
Thank you very much, Martin. Перед тем, как
Before discussing the experience of Russia in horizontal monitoring application, this experience is not very rich, but still very illustrative. I would like to thank all the participants who have made it for this forum, to our colleagues, to the speakers who agreed to contribute into the discussion and share their best practices and experience, and also say some words of gratitude to Sergei Rakelov, who was Deputy Director of the Federal Service, but unfortunately he couldn't come to this forum. Now in Moscow, international development, there's an important forum is going on, and many OECD countries have arrived, and his Russian representative at that OECD forum. But now we have a woman, a lady in the presidium, and now it's high time to discuss the role of female lawyers in the implementation of horizontal monitoring system. Among Russian participants, we have representatives of the companies with which the tax service has signed an agreement of cooperation, and I will introduce them one by one when I give the floor over to them. And then I'm very happy that just Arbitros Court head has agreed to join us, and hopefully he will also share some of the practices of the international agreement implementation in the area of horizontal monitoring. But in the very beginning, please let me explain how it happened that the Federal Tax Service of the Russian Federation decided to initiate the implementation of this project, the project for horizontal monitoring or information cooperation with Russian business companies. Federal services often participate in international forums and international conventions, and still administering is a very special, isolated topic. Taxpayers, when assessing the quality of tax administration, they accept it as something given. They were never invited to contribute into this process. And this is why we are very glad that this project is now being implemented, and that we could organize this first dialogue with taxpayers, or a round table discussion, when we can together discuss what can be done in order to improve the quality of tax administration. And all the speakers by our international colleagues spoke about transparency, trust, mutual understanding. Probably these are the key principles, the key drivers that should not only be borrowed, but that should be learned. And probably learning them is the most difficult thing. And this is what I wanted to discuss. So Federal Service, well, it has been only several months that we have had this pilot project. Before that, we had made some steps in order to implement those core principles. Our taxation system is only 15 years old, and the major laws on taxation were written then. And within these 15 years, we've been following the path of simplification of the norms for tax paying, the norms of taxation. And from the very beginning, we reduced the number of taxes. We had 50 types of taxes, and now we reduced them down to 13, and then we have special regimes for tax paying. And that then set the right trend in paying taxes. Besides, from the very beginning, when we started the modernization program and all the technical processes were upgraded, and everybody realized that maximum web technologies, international technologies should be used in order to organize feedback from taxpayers and in order to make payments an easier process. I think that many of you know that the Federal Tax Service started this by making changes to its official website, and service component became predominant. But out of all the services that we offer to a moment, it's online tax payment and the personal office. We think that this is the greatest achievement because both legal entities and physical persons in this personal office can look through their tax obligations, and this is the first step towards feedback to the tax services about some mistakes probably or gaps. And this was the first step made towards this profound dialogue. And we believe that in 2009 an important step was when the procedure of amicable settlement was introduced through special law. Yes, indeed, disputes should not be brought to the court. As John rightly said, this should be the very last instance. Before that, maximum effort should be invested into negotiations and settling the conflict before that. So this mandated amicable settlement system means the possibility for the taxpayer to address the higher standing financial or just tax body for some explanation. Some of the taxpayers perceive it as the opportunity for settling disputes, the opportunity for not bringing it to court, opportunity of saving money, saving financial resources and time resources and efforts. For us, methodologically, it's also a very important change. Making decision about the incorrect step means that we create a case which, and for a taxpayer, it's an important information that further on during tax checkups or when planning his business or when just assessing the risks, they will understand that should they take an incorrect position, that would open them up for further problems with tax services. So this is helpful in understanding how the Federal Service interprets norms and regulations. The next step was associated with the court practice. It's no secret, and it's not only for Russian taxpayers. It is clear that not all the norms can be simply implemented. There are some methodological issues that are open to different interpretation, and the rules of how courts should interpret them, or like they have case law in some of the countries. In Russia it's different, but the position of the Supreme Arbitrage Court is an important explanation. For us, it's the necessity for the Supreme Arbitrage Court to just for its decisions to become the basis for the further methodology of norm interpretation. Tax authorities used to decide themselves whether to turn to the Supreme Court or not. But 2 years ago, a new position was introduced, a new approach was introduced. That is that such decisions should be coordinated with the Federal Tax Service. That enabled us to consider some important issues of concern, and also we reduced the number of applications to the Supreme Arbitrage Court, and such legal positions are now taken into account when doing audits, tax audits, and taxpayers are clear. For him to assess the tax risk in applying this or that norm, it is enough just to look through the court practice. Then for Russian taxpayers, it's probably more important than elsewhere. This taxpayer will look through the letters published by the Ministry of Finance. The legislation of the Russian Federation mandates it that the Ministry of Finance can provide explanations for the tax regulations, and such explanations are mandatory for federal tax service too. And we know the situations when the letters would express different position on the same issue, or they in different sources, or they were located in different information sources, and that made it difficult for the taxpayer to find the right letter or just to understand which interpretation is correct. So we decided to improve this situation. We attempted to, on the website of the Federal Service, we attempted to collect only those letters of the Ministry of Finance that have a mandatory character for us. And we have a new service now, which is explanatory letters of the Ministry of Finance, and that serve as guidelines for us. For taxpayers, it's an easier way of just assessing his tax risks. He now knows where to look for the information, and he can now understand which position will be taken by the Federal Service or the Ministry of Finance. For us, it's also beneficial because we can monitor the information, whether those letters are used or not, and then we just monitor what happens with those positions in courts, and then we can reconsider some of our approaches and even submit some suggestions for changes. The next step was
Подойти к налоговому
to approach a tax audit, because if I taxpayer the tax risks, it is important to understand how he will be controlled by the tax authorities. So this understanding was important for both taxpayers and the tax authorities. So last year it was decided to change the attitude and approaches to tax audits and controls. So we decreased the number of audits for bona fide taxpayers, and as we reviewed our criteria, risk-based criteria, so to speak, which can help identify the risk level for potential tax breaches and offences by behalf of the taxpayers. So these criteria were publicized on the website, and the taxpayer can use them to identify the probability of its being checked and audited by the tax authorities. That was a major development in clarifying the application of norms and rules and claims to the taxpayers. So the decrease in number of tax audits increases undoubtedly the quality of the checks and changes the approach to tax audits and control, because there is a shift from bona fide taxpayers to more focused on high risk breach risk taxpayers. We were aware that the international practice has already developed certain tested approaches to tax administration, so we decided to use the experience of international experience in order to shift the focus from bona fide taxpayers to high risk and shift more to horizontal monitoring, when we offer not privileges, but the possibility for bona fide taxpayers to be checked less frequently, and just there was important to obtain relevant information about the business of this taxpayer to understand what they do and how they could be checked. Hence, we decided to vote for the horizontal monitoring strategy. We entered into agreement with major Russian companies. These agreements stipulate online information provision. Our foreign guests have already spoken at length about this principle. We check how the business is organized and structured, and just we agree on certain tax payment rules and procedures. We check their compliance. So, in order to understand that this was quite a natural step to make for the Russian Federation Tax Service, because all the initiatives that come from the power always look suspicious for citizens. But we decided that the dialogue-based model with taxpayer would help overcome this preconception in order to move together in closer cooperation to introduce the principles like clarity, understanding and trust that were many times mentioned by our foreign guests before. We are going to now turn the floor over to the parties of the to the agreements that we have signed within this pilot project. We are at the very beginning of this long way. The word to build trust is something that can be termed as easier said than done, because to trust each other, one has to learn how to do it. One has to understand that this is it takes a long time and it's a long way to build trust, and maybe in Russia it will take more time than our foreign colleagues. Thank you, and I wanted to turn the floor over to the judge from the Higher Court of Arbitration. First, because why I was talking about horizontal monitoring as a mechanism, as a pre-trial settlement method, because this is a method which is quite close to tax compromise approach, because taxpayers and tax authorities settle their disputes not through trial but by negotiations, and it is often compared with amicable agreement between the taxpayer and tax authority. Last year we had quite a promising and positive experience in entering into such amicable agreement, which were done at the litigation stage, at the trial stage already. However, that was a major breakthrough, because previously it was thought to be impossible, or the community was sure it was not possible with the public power. So Gennady Pirshetov is the next speaker. Thank you very much, Elena. Good afternoon once again, dear colleagues. If we look back at the relationship between taxpayers and tax authorities in retrospect, so if we review the last 7-8 years, this relationship has seen quite a major breakthrough. And you, I hope, would agree with me. I see a lot of many of those who participated in the first and the second forum among the audience members, and the issues that we discussed 1 or 2 years ago brought us quite logically to the issues that were posed for discussion today. And if just some year ago we were just afraid to mention the possibility of amicable agreement between the taxpayers and tax authorities, now we can quite openly and boldly speak about it and determine the set of criteria that such agreement should meet. Indeed, it was quite recently that the legal environment and the clarifications by the Higher Court of Arbitration did not allow for such agreements to be concluded. To name just a few statements of the plenary sessions by the Higher Court of Arbitration. So there was a resolution from the 31st of October 1996, number 13. So it was stipulated that amicable agreement was not allowed arising from the relationship with the administrative and civil relationship. So then it was compliant with the then administrative code. So legally it was not possible in public relationship to speak about the possibility of concluding the amicable agreement. But the new civil code, Civil Procedure Code 2001, such an opportunity was provided for, and the resolution of the plenum was referring to Article 190, so that because of arbitration should rely on the basis that the public bodies cannot overuse the regulations and powers that were provided for them legally by the state. So this law did not allow for such opportunity, and the legal practice, recognizing that the tax authorities were not in a position of entering into amicable agreement, did not follow this track. However, life went on, and so the High Court of Arbitration was quite an active contributor to the process, and the legislation has become more progressive towards this option. In terms of conciliation procedures and pre-trial agreements and resolutions. Today, speaking about the pre-trial procedure development, we take it as for granted, because the issues that we faced 3 to 4 years ago now have long been resolved. So considering this current situation, when all the efforts were targeted at making disputes refocus from trial regulation to pre-trial regulation, so in such a progressive situation, it would be a retrograde approach to silence the opportunity of amicable agreement. So this good and not had to be cut. It would be no secret to say that the High Court of Arbitration repeatedly overcame and overcame decades-long stereotypes. So the stereotype of impossibility of amicable agreement, for example. So it was quite logical to expect that the Presidium of the High Court of Arbitration would be the first to overcome this stereotypes. On the 26th of June last year, such a resolution was taken by the Presidium in a dispute between the tax authorities and royalty stock company, limited liability company. So it was quite a well publicized and disputed case in press, and the most important thing about this case, in my opinion, is and the resolution that followed, is that at the level of the Presidium of the High Court of Arbitration, it was for the first time that the possibility of amicable agreement between the taxpayer and the tax authority was deemed possible. However, both taxpayers and tax authorities were quite suspicious and uncertain about this instrument. So now a few words about a set of criteria which should not be relied upon during amicable agreement between taxpayers and tax authorities. So the common opinion previously was that legal issues cannot be negotiated during this process, and this stereotype was also overcome in the resolution of the Higher Court of Arbitration in its relevant resolution. Those who know the nature, the essence of the resolution would understand, and I could clarify for others. So the tax period was set out there. It would depend first on how you qualify the transaction, whether it was a purchase agreement or marketing service agreement. So the dispute between the taxpayer and tax authority was about that. So the taxpayer agreed with the tax administration that it had to be qualified as marketing service rendering, and on this basis they achieved an agreement, amicable agreement. So when the transaction is to be requalified, it involves some legal issues. Discussion. Of course, the tax rate cannot be subject to negotiation. It is, and nobody doubts that. However, qualifying some payments as taxable, this is also a very fine line, which one has to be very careful with. But for example, this physical person income. So whether it can be qualified as a compensation or as a payroll, as a salary, or it can be not a compensation, not a salary payment. There are several presidium resolutions to the income tax and the insurance tax and the social tax. These issues, qualification issues, are quite often arise to be resolved. So just distinguishing between these criteria is very important, and it's not only that the resolution on this case reflects this position of the High Court of Arbitration. The court made it possible to conclude amicable agreement on requalifying transactions even earlier than that. In 2011, the High Court of Arbitration adopted a draft amending legal acts of the Russian Federation in an effort to optimize the conciliation procedure. The draft was considered by the State Duma, and in accordance with the passport of this federal draft. So this draft is not will go through quite a thorny way. However, in August 2012, it was tabled for the discussion in State Duma. But in April 2012, the Duma took a decision to refer this draft to the public chamber, to the Council of Federation, government, and other levels. So I hope that this draft would not be just shelved, and it stands quite a good chance to be adopted. So this draft, this bill, allows for just new wording of Article 190 of the Administrative Court. So I quote: "Economic disputes arising from administrative and other public relationship can be settled by the parties through reconciliation procedures in compliance with Charter 15 by the current code, if otherwise is not stated by the current code, existing legislation, or not arising from the existing legal relationship." And what's important is that as a result of the conciliation of the parties can be recognition as an agreement which was quite self-evident, and then agreement by the parties containing the qualification of the party or the status or the nature of activity of this person. So I think that in terms of concluding amicable agreement between taxpayers and tax administration, we have achieved quite a big progress, and I hope we will carry along the same lines in the future, we're concluding this agreement not at just a litigation state, but providing for the possibility of entering into amicable agreement between taxpayers and tax authorities at the pre-trial stage. Maybe it has to be controlled by the Federal Tax Service, and what forms of control to use remains to be further discussed. I think just the legislative level should be appropriate in such a situation. So I hope that a certain progress in developing pre-trial settlement procedures and further development of the possibility of amicable agreement has been achieved. We are moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Now we have a representative from Severstal company, Boris Muravyov, so the floor is yours. Thank you very much. In my presentation, I would like to consider 4 issues. First of all, I'd like to share the experience we've accumulated within the framework of this project, and then look into the core principles of enhanced relationship. And in conclusion, I would like to share some of the suggestions as to how to improve the practice of this mechanism implementation. So, our experience is not rich yet. We entered the agreement relatively recently. Likewise, other companies, we just started providing full access to our documentation. In return, we got the right to discuss our tax positions on all the transactions and the principles with tax services. Then, if all the documents are provided and if the positions are agreed and if the taxpayer follows its obligations, we can expect not to be controlled, no tax audits. Right now we are in the process of signing the protocol on information interaction when procedures for providing information disclosure will be stipulated. We will render full and complete ongoing access to our documentation, and should tax inspector fail to find the information he or she needs, we will help getting access to this information. What does it give the taxpayer? What does it give us? We hope to improve the level of certainty in the area of our tax obligations and rights. Hence, there will be less retrospective tax returns. That will also decrease the number of trial settlements and decrease paperwork for us. But especially the risk of retrospective tax returns and administering will impact positively onto the company's value. So what do we see as the fundamentals of enhanced relationship? These are the conditions or prerequisites without which this interaction is impossible. There are two of them. It's trust, the trust that has been mentioned not once here, and also legitimacy. What do we imply by trust? It's just personal, interpersonal relations between people. And it takes time to build, and it requires certain communication skills. Trust relationship, it's relationship when one side just takes into account the interests of the other side in making steps. It's very difficult to have legal regulation for trust. What can be regulated is the consequences of the disruption of this type of relationship. So we are not getting any additional rights as compared to other taxpayers, but we have additional opportunities to expect not to be subjected to standard tax controls. For example, when the taxpayer just meets its obligations, discloses information and all that, and then for some reasons the tax service cancels the agreement. But why not assuring some more guarantees for the taxpayer, just for the latter not to be subjected to additional tax controls in the previous period of time before the contract breacher? So the second component was legitimacy. So we believe that legitimacy is about the following. This type of relationship should be probably provisioned by the legislation. Some conditions of voluntary entering and exiting this relationship, some criteria should be written about how this tax control method differs from all others. As has been said here, it's first and foremost the agreement of tax positions before submitting tax return. So probably this should be fixed in the law. The next slide shows the principles of enhanced relationship as we see it. Maybe these are just the rules that must be followed by the sides in the process of this model implementation. We break them down into two categories, depending on who should fulfill those rules, taxpayer or tax service, as you see. Then the next principle to be followed by taxpayer is the principle of transparency and openness. There are two sides of this principle. It's full information, nothing to be concealed, and timeliness. Information should be submitted before the tax returns are submitted. Maybe the and the priority to decide about the format and method of submission should be given to tax services. Just then the taxpayers should use special type of information basis, because information disclosure still remains an important issue. And then the principles that should be followed by the tax services are described on this slide. Number one principle is disaffection and objectiveness. It logically issues from the following. If the taxpayer discloses full information, then that gives the ground to believe that, well, actually, some tax service can probably abuse this information, misuse it, not to allow it happen. Tax services should base their actions, their behavior on the literal interpretation of the law. And we think that in disputable situations, decisions must be made in favor of taxpayer. Should disputes be not resolved on that level, then probably some specialists or consultants, Ministry of Finance experts should be attracted. The most important thing is just voluntary following that. The next one is proportionality in tax risk assessment. So tax monitoring aims at decreasing the costs of tax administering. And we believe that in assessing and following proportionality in tax risk assessment, they will not overestimate certain important positions. We are also hopeful that tax services will not dig into some petty things. Of course, there are some petty things always, and fines should be used only to stop taxpayer from making mistakes in the and main steps should be taken to help the taxpayer avoid making mistakes, be proactive. And the third principle is awareness about the business goal and client orientation. We realize that the concept of enhanced relations cannot be implemented if the tax services do not or fail to understand the business goal. Or if they have a different understanding of the business goal from that of the company itself. So the company and tax service should have the similar understanding of business environment, business goals, and this will serve as a solid foundation for building this relationship without without just addressing the courts. And my conclusion, how can we improve the model? 4 suggestions for improvement that would enhance this institute in the legal practice. So this mechanism should be anchored in the tax code. There should be certain principles written there and the norms. The second the principle of voluntary entering and others. Maybe the second suggestion is to increase the mutual trust between taxpayer and tax service. So probably tax authorities should have a special function to implement this horizontal monitoring. And this function should include specialists on tax law and also specialists and experts on business, the nature of business. Then the next suggestion is, since horizontal monitoring and enhanced relationships are built on trust, trust should be enhanced and developed. So we should think about some special programs for that. Choose some navigators, so to speak. People would learn how to interact, how to build this interaction between tax services and taxpayers, and then those navigators would be the main carriers of and promoters of trust. And finally, I'm giving the floor to Alexander Pahomov, who represents OES Russia.
Good afternoon. I regular and often visit my personal office and my website. I'm quite okay there. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are into OES, like Ernst & Young, Rosgidro, and TS, and other companies. We entered into this agreement that was mentioned before. I will very briefly comment on the process because much has been said already. So the tax system depends on how the investment options and system look. So our esteemed guest from Holland is here, so we made a little comparative site on the size of taxes in Russia and in Holland, and considering that the social contribution, personal income tax ranges from 30 to 50% in Holland, profit tax is up to 25% after 200,000 euros, and with VAT being 21%. So Holland looks a more attractive jurisdiction for structuring holding companies and business activities than the Russian Federation. So then it's not a question of tax rates, but the question of overall system of tax control, approaches, attitudes and openness, maybe even the history of development of relationship between taxpayers and tax authorities. I would very briefly go through the major problems. This lack of understanding of business process, which also leads to the imperfect tax system. So the administrative limitations are both internal and external, so the legal basis is imperfect, like I said, and the major contradiction here is between the Federal Tax Service and the Ministry of Finance, who are at odds in a number of issues, and just the attitudes and mindsets of both taxpayers and tax authorities, because over a very kind of brief time when our tax legislation evolved back in 1990s and 2000, yet it was time was not enough to build an objective tax system like in other countries like the UK and Holland, which took decades and decades to evolve. So these are the major issues to raise in this respect. As to the expected outcomes, so we were very keen on being part of this pilot project on horizontal monitoring, not just a company pursuing some personal goals, but as a company that would pave the way, so to speak, and will help build new approaches in the relation between the fiscal bodies and taxpayers. So extended pre-trial settlement tools, which is one of the major foci in the tax authorities, and as we see developments and progress in our company already. So many rulings and decisions are taken as a result of the appeal by the higher tax authority. So just a risk-based approach, as we expect, will also expand, because the tax authorities cannot encompass such a huge amount of audited companies, so they will have to using this tool, they will use their resources more effectively and ease up the taxpayer's life. The criteria can be diverse and focusing on some other things, unlike many foreign practices, like the final beneficiary information disclosure. Can also become the basis for the risk-based approach. Mr. Panchenko will probably tell more about it in his turn. And some other advantages, just receiving the budgetary resources in a more efficient way, and just other events. So what we have done we also provided online access to our bookkeeping and accounting. So the Federal Tax Service can monitor the accounting systems of the company with 1 week time lag. And we hope that this will lead us to reduce number of field and study checks, because we could enter into a dialogue and question and answer online during the horizontal monitoring checks. We don't have any procedure for just cooperation and dialogue between, because this is a major document that determines the interaction process between the taxpayer and tax authority, and also the taxpayers were very keen to discuss the needs or just requests opportunity, and they filed a lot of queries and requests to the tax authority because in the future we expect that this position will be used not only in specific taxpayers' cases, but will be more common in other cases as well. One of the major advantages of this extended relationship, so Interau and Rosgidro would not only be vertically kind of viewed, but also horizontally. However, the major advantage was the dialogue, a constructive dialogue between the taxpayer and tax authority, and not a dialogue whether to use the tax rate of 10 or 18 or pay or not to pay, as the person from the High Arbitration Court mentioned, but just interpretation of a certain tax legislation in a specific situation with this company. We think it's a positive development, and this amicable agreement opportunity was used in 3 cases. I'm not going to give details about the subjects of the amicable agreement, so this information is publicized. One can look it up on his own. However, it's important. What was important for us was not the sum, because it was 40 million as a result of the dispute, the subject of the dispute. What was important, that at the cassation stage we determined an approach to determine the taxable base for the future, considering specific tax situation. So pre-trial, either pre-trial settlement or entering into an amicable agreement at the litigation stage will become components of a general approach to such extended relationship, which will help decrease financial burden and will save staff member time, and in general will help to streamline the tax system and make it more consistent. I think I know that some of the advisors, the consultants, were not happy about this new development, because the tax authority and taxpayer basically reduce the number of cases that will involve consultants and advisors. But our consultants and advisors are quite progressive people, and like in many other developed countries, they should become drivers of this new trend and maybe act as mediators, which is a question open for further discussion. Now, as to amicable agreements, yes, we have no legal regulations to enter into such agreements, so the tax authority cannot change the sum and the time period for payment of the tax. And another issue about the opinion of the tax administration after the amicable agreement is taken. So I think these three issues has to be looked at by the legislative bodies, and we would like to see them considered and resolved in the nearest future. And in conclusion, I would like to say for those who say that the amicable agreement or any other ATR, like in Holland, or the pre-regulated contract value, is not a corruption element, because people who are unaware of the essence of this agreement can only say so, because it's not the norm that is being agreed upon, but the special situation. So Russia, the norms of the tax legislation, I mean, in Russia, much too often, so the norms of the tax legislation can be interpreted differently, and this is our one of the major issues in Russia in terms of amicable agreement. Has there been just only one interpretation possible in interpretation of this or that norm? So we could agree whether it is applicable in this or that situation, and then just...
Thank you very much, Alexander. Уже новый стол.
Да,
ваш. Дмитрий Панченко, представитель компании «Росгидро».
Уважаемые коллеги, очень приятно. Я понимаю, что я нахожусь уже за пределами времени, и было очень много сказано, поэтому я скажу два аспекта новых, которые касались совсем немного. Выступающие понимают эту ситуацию. Росгидро, как компания с государственным участием, а таких много в российской экономике, мы имеем в том числе и свой взгляд, который, как кажется, будет не безинтересен всем, на то, что такое горизонтальный мониторинг может значить для нас. То есть я хотел бы коснуться проблемы, которую на пленарном заседании затрагивал председатель Конституционного суда Валерий Дмитриевич Зорькин, о том, что правоотношения меняются быстрее норм. И неопределенности, несмотря на активный нормотворческий процесс, неопределенности остается довольно много. Компании госсектора столкнулись с необходимостью такого нормативного повышения комплаенса, раскрытием бенефициаров, то, о чем говорил Интерау Пахомов. Но норм этих все еще нет, а требования уже есть. Кроме того, на примере Росгидро совсем недавно произошел такой челлендж Института разумной осмотрительности. То есть был поставлен фактически вопрос, как он должен применяться, насколько должны быть расширены его границы на всех субпоставщиков и так далее. То есть, я о чем говорю, мы видим большую подвижность нормативных границ и то, что правоотношения фактически меняются, а нормы, закрепляющие и определяющие, пока не успевают. Вот мы видим соглашение о горизонтальном мониторинге, два аспекта здесь очень нам помогут. Первое – это то, что в рамках соглашения, в рамках рулинга мы можем восполнять нормативные пробелы и добиваться для себя нормативного поведения, проявления разумной осмотрительности в ситуации, когда еще пока не сложилось нормативное регулирование этих аспектов деятельности. В ситуации изменчивости для нас это очень важно. И второй момент, о котором я хочу сказать, существуют, допустим, сертификаты стандарта качества. Однако сертификаты таких высоких процедур комплаенса в России их пока еще нет. То есть нет такого индикатора, получив который, сдав экзамены, выполнив все процедуры, можно было бы быть открытыми и со всей очевидностью открытыми для всех. Например, аналог, можно сказать, это то, что при выпуске ценных бумаг на биржах раскрывается определенные нормы и так далее. Вот мы надеемся на то, что участие в горизонтальном мониторинге будет являться таким индикатором, и возможно, мы на это надеемся, что после завершения эксперимента и перехода к нормативному регулированию этому смыслу и значению будет придан нормативный статус. То есть, вступив в горизонтальный мониторинг, мы сможем надеяться на восполнение пробелов нормативного регулирования и демонстрацию своей открытости, транспарентности широкому рынку. Ну, наверное, это все, на чем я сегодня остановлюсь. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. И Дмитрий Корнев, представитель компании МТС, мобильной системы.
Я боюсь, что...
Остановиться на одном из интереснейших вопросов. Материалы, я думаю, будут доступны, все можно будет посмотреть. Я хотел бы остановиться, наверное, на одном из самых интересных вопросов с нашей точки зрения, который выражается в следующем. Когда мы говорим о доверии, о взаимном доверии, безусловно, всегда встает вопрос, а какой инструмент для того, чтобы это доверие действительно было? Потому что разговор о том, что мы должны друг другу взаимно доверять, он, безусловно, накладывается на определенный бэкграунд. И вопрос в том, а что это должно быть, он, тем не менее, остается вполне открытым. И вот, соответственно, как бы в рамках нашего проекта мы также пытаемся выстроить с налоговым органом ответ на этот вопрос. И мы попытались каким-то образом конкретизировать, что значит прозрачность и что значит взаимное доверие и взаимопонимание. Если говорить о прозрачности, мы пришли к определенному формату, что та система внутреннего контроля и та ERP-система, которая у нас есть, она должна быть в определенной степени протестирована и подтверждена налоговым органом на предмет того, что она позволяет идентифицировать все наиболее существенные операции, которые формируют налоговую нагрузку. Когда мы говорим о критерии взаимного доверия и взаимопонимания, мы говорим о том, что мы предполагаем наличие процедуры, которая позволяет, что все такого рода существенные позиции могут быть обсуждены, может быть сформулирована техническая позиция.
We believe that this can help us design a certain settlement procedure. So consequently, here, briefly, we have introduced the model or the framework for the model that we are now following the process of automatization of our relations with tax authorities. So hopefully we'll have the system tested soon. The next thing, which is very, very important, and this can be reduced to the following. What we believe to be important tasks, especially within the framework of the dialogue at this forum. We believe that the project for horizontal monitoring implies the transition to detailed discussion of the implementation of the mechanisms of preliminary tax explanations. We believe that preliminary explanations is an important issue, and this is now going on within the framework of horizontal monitoring model, and this will also yield interesting materials, enabling us to build the logics and the algorithm for the appropriate model. And one more important issue in our view is that the criteria that are now in existence are negative criteria. Well, it can sound as an exotic suggestion, but we believe that in horizontal monitoring we can really make a transition to forming the Any person displaying this appropriate behavior should be entitled or empowered to become member of the system. And maybe the next interesting issue is what it is that we are discussing with our tax service now. We identify significant operations. We provide detailed descriptions on each operation down to technical model and the order of reflecting it in our accounting. And before the end of this current year, we plan to have most operations covered. The operations that seem to be significant from the point of view of tax services. So just marked in black is what we plan to for the future. And two main things. Well, horizontal monitoring does not assure that there will be no dispute, but just should the position be not agreed. The only difference is that those disputes with horizontal monitoring should preferably be settled amicably. So I would ask you all, appeal to you all to support horizontal monitoring project because it's a real breakthrough initiative. And this project reflects the willingness and readiness of tax service to assume responsibility for their positions formulated. And this is great. Thank you for your attention. Okay. In closure, I'd like to say a couple of words and then pass over to my co-chair. Maybe we'll have some questions from the audience. So still summarizing the experience, the Russian experience. A lot of work is to be done by the tax services. Yes, there are some interesting tools. Yes, there is a lot of space for improvement. As for taxpayers, they should also enhance the Institute of Tax Paying. And they should contribute their efforts and their part. Martin, the floor is yours now.
I would like to thank you all very much for your patience also, for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any last questions, this is the moment. Otherwise...
Could I please make a last remark, Martin? Co-production. I've heard all what is said about horizontal monitoring. I heard what in Russia happens with horizontal monitoring. And I think although some other countries have taken the first step, I think Russia will take the great leap into the future of horizontal monitoring, the way they handle it within companies and tax revenue bodies. Thank you, Helena, for moderating and hosting us.
Well, are there any questions from the audience? If there are, yes, we have a couple of minutes. Ovsyannikov, St. Petersburg State University. So we've been present and we've been listening to this idyllic picture of this experiment implementation and those positive expectations, but knowing historical experience and the mentality and trust is an element of understanding the law and the attitude. We know that our mentality is law-oriented. So yes, agreements are important, but only and if they are legalized by the formal law. Right now, this institute is absent. And my question is addressed to Elena Vladimirovna. As far as I understand, now some agreements are already signed on horizontal monitoring and are being implemented. But how? Well, on behalf of the Federal Tax Service, how do they do the settlement, consultancy, explanations? Well, PricewaterhouseCoopers representatives said the very right words. They must be people with strong will, capable of making decisions and also having deep knowledge of business processes. But right now, who are those people in federal tax services who assume responsibility on issuing such normative acts? And can they be reconsidered, reviewed in the future? Well, let me give a very, very brief answer. Well, it has been noted by the participants of our roundtable that these agreements are about enhanced information cooperation. It's voluntary submission of information by taxpayers and also the possibility for the tax services to provide explanations within the existing tax legislation. That means that the taxpayer can address the tax service asking for explanations about a specific transaction. Yes, of course, we have our norms about how to calculate taxes due, but if it is not described by the written rules, we have the right of addressing the Ministry of Finance, asking for their explanations and interpretation. And then the Ministry of Finance has the full right to provide such explanations, which will then have legal force. Should it be an unsettled dispute, then the Ministry of Finance is the instance that can start initiating or that can initiate the change in the written law. So now it may seem that we are operating beyond the boundaries of the written law, but nevertheless we are not in contradiction with the latter. And I don't want to repeat myself, but indeed, in my view, the most important thing is entering the changes, including changes concerning the criteria chosen by the taxpayer for reducing tax control. And at the initial stage, it can be the criteria of risk or just the criteria of, and explanations, of course. Also, some energy companies, other companies, the whole industries have commonly shared problems, and they need explanations of global scale and scope. And indeed, we have enough room for development. And having started with just bona fide approach, we are developing it towards written laws. Alexandra Havina from the newspaper Economics and Life. My question is to Hank. Hank, could you please explain how do you work about, with small business, on which level the decisions are made, who can become participant, and whether the agreements with large businesses are similar to the agreements with small businesses in horizontal monitoring?
Deals are made. The exact question.
Каким образом?
Can you hear me now? Okay. Повторите.
Нет.
Okay, so yes, re-asking it. How do you sign agreements with small businesses or middle-sized businesses? And what is the difference between this and agreements with large businesses? No.
Conclude an agreement with a large business, we do it with the board of directors. And having our highest ranking tax inspector director signing it. Going to press. Take a picture of it and publish it in the newspaper so all the world sees here is an agreement between a big company and the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration. It's not done with small-sized companies. Here you've got a tax advisor having something like 100 clients, 200 clients, and having an agreement with him or her. We have an agreement with all his clients behind him. And that's the way we treat the smaller size companies. But these agreements are not often published in papers and are done on a lower level with the normal tax inspector. Is an answer to your question?
Well, so three participants, three sides. Who are they?
Three participants. You've got the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration. You've got a tax advisor and his clients behind him. And the report about Dutch practice is critical about this, saying, does the tax advisor, does he work for the Tax and Customs Administration? It's a point in our country of criticism. And the strongest point of the report from the committee, so it's a very good question. Yes, thank you. And
I have only one question here. I represent tax service. I spent 5 years working as a tax inspector, and hence my question. And what do you do if, when implementing horizontal monitoring, you have a conflict of interest between tax body, its main goal being control over the tax, and if there are any conflicts of interests, how did you resolve those conflicts in practice? I mean, conflicts rooted in mental stereotypes.
Arising between the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration and people having an agreement are mostly settled around a round table. Just sit down, having the board of directors talk about it and try to find out a solution. And if not, go to court. Going to court, agree to disagree, doesn't mean we haven't got a compliance agreement. Having a compliance agreement, you should be able to disagree about tax points. And if you want to, you even can go to a court. We don't like you to search for the boundaries of tax evasion. Then we're talking on another way, on another level. Thank you.
I also represent a tax service, and my question is to Dmitry, MTS representative. Well, how do you see the development after the pilot project? Of course, you will say that it should go over onto the legislation level, but do you think that the next steps must be similar to those within the pilot project framework, or should they be different? You know, our approach here is very conservative. We don't know the final outcome of this pilot project, and we believe that the system we are implementing will either be considered by the financial services as enough ground not to check us up at all, or it will serve as a solid foundation for building a system, a legal system with higher predictability. So, methodological basis, but still the goal that we anticipate, or we hope that we'll be able to convince the government that they shouldn't really make formal checkups at all. But otherwise, of course, legal issues are serious and require serious consideration. You know what? We are lagging behind schedule. This room is needed now for the next round table. I have another question, Dmitry, to you and to colleagues in agreement. So how did you assess the risks of exiting this project? Suppose you didn't like it. You stop disclosing information. So what can be the penalty for you? No. Our position here is very simple. For us, it's a reputational issue. So this proves our openness. That proves that we understand our responsibility, that we want to improve the overall investment climate in the country. And we assume that it will find positive response. And this is why the outcome can't be negative for us. Yes, of course, we can exit, but negative outcome is impossible. Still, summarizing this roundtable discussion, I'd like to say, last year we organized a roundtable discussion here where we discussed the pre-trial settlements. And we presented our suggestion for a new law. And today this law has been adopted in the first reading. So I believe that today we had a roundtable discussion. Next year, if you come for this forum, there will be some outcome to discuss and maybe some changes in the written legislation. So let's bring it to closure right now and let's meet again next year. And then we'll continue discussing horizontal monitoring in Russia. Best luck to you and let's call it a day. Thank you for your attention.